Dino, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all participants, as well attendees. This is our first webinar. So I'm Jamin Warren. I'm the founder of Killscreen. Killscreen is an arts and culture organization committed to advancing the practice of interdisciplinary play. We were founded back in 2010. We took a brief hiatus for a little bit, but coming back, we seek to drive the intersection of design, culture, and impact through cross-disciplinary collaboration to show the world why play matters. We're really trying to break down the barriers that have traditionally separated play and games from other creative disciplines and foster a diverse community of creators with ambassadorial relationships to the world around us. And so this is our first webinar. We've done live events in the past with our first webinar through Zoom. So thank you for joining us, and please bear with us if there are any issues along the way. So before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. If you're on Zoom, click on hide non-video participants. So if you see Camille, who will be in the background helping out, you can please hide them. We'll also be recording this and posting it a bit later. There is a Q&A button, which should be down there at the bottom. So feel free to ask questions throughout Dino's presentation. I'll do my best to try to field them as we go. You won't see them show up unless we approve them. So if you ask a question, then you don't see it popped up. And you see it pop up, then you won't be able to see it until we approve the question. But you can leave your question, I'll take a look. And if we don't get to it during the presentation, we'll try to answer them at the end. And if you have any technical questions, please let us know. You can shoot us an email at info@killscreen.com. Or again, you can use that Q&A button if you have any technical issues or questions. Also, you can follow us on Twitter. We're at Killscreen, or on Instagram at killscreen.com. Awesome. Well, let's get started. All right. Well, Dino, this is Dino. Dino's with us. Dino is the design lead at Facebook Reality Labs, working with a team of researchers, developers, and engineers to create the future of virtual and augmented reality. Previously, Dino was the user experience director at Visceral Games. We'll talk about that, one of Electronic Arts Studios, where he created groundbreaking user interface designs for games like Dead Space and Dante's Inferno. Dino has over a decade of work across mediums, from illustration to motion design to UX UI. And so, yeah, I think to get started, Dino, could you tell us a little bit about your background and like how you ultimately made your way into the world of games?
Thank you so much for having me today. I was born and raised in the Philippines. That's where I started, and I started my career really, really getting into like fine arts first. Like back in the early '90s, I had a very limited worldview of what it meant to be a creator, what it meant to be an artist, and I thought that learning how to be a traditional painter was the path to it. And then, very, very early on, I realized that, I think there's a way to get there through new media's coming out. So back in '94, a friend gave me a hand-me-down modem. I think it was a 14.4 baud modem at the time. And I got connected to like CompuServe, and I started seeing this like world emerging around me of like what the future of the internet could be, and all these like emerging media. And I made a silly website called Bird is Evil, which eventually got me nominated for the second Webby Awards. And I flew to San Francisco to accept the award. And at that moment in time, I met a whole bunch of like luminaries in like this new field where technology and art were coming together. And I realized, this is where I need to be. And so a year after that, 1999, after the year after the Webbies that I won, I moved to San Francisco and started to pursue a career in computer arts and design at the Academy of Art. This slide is a little busted, but don't worry about it. I think anyway. So that's basically been my path to where I am now. And so I ended up working at Visceral after working at GameSpot for a year, getting into like working in the journalistic side of games, and eventually landing in EA, where I worked on Dead Space, Dante's Inferno, like you mentioned, a bunch of Battlefield Hardline, a bunch of Battlefields from Battlefield 3, 4, and Hardline, and eventually the unreleased Star Wars game. And then I moved to Oculus, and eventually within that became more involved in like the design of stuff within Facebook, which is where I am now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Was this always something that you thought that you might be interested in, like as a creative? Looking at your career path, working for motion design, or from art school, was that something that you were thinking about going into the in the world of games as someone teaching themselves, learning in school?
That's an excellent question. So I'll be honest, when I was getting into the Academy of Art, I had this idea that I was going to get into movies. Like I was thinking that maybe the path for me was, as you can probably see in the slide that you have up right now, I'm a nerd at heart. Like I cosplay with my daughter. I build random props. These are some of the things I've done over the pandemic. Like we built an R2D2. Like I love sci-fi. So in my mind, I was like, oh, I'm gonna go work at Lucasfilm one day. Um, and games was always something I was interested in. I always loved playing games ever since I was young, but I think my thinking was that my thinking at the time was that I was going to get into cinema. Interestingly enough, no, the year that I graduated from the Academy of Art, which was 2005, was the year that there was a lot of layoffs in the industry. It was just across the board. There's a big shift in the way movies were being made. I think Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and Matrix were just over, and then they were letting go of all these people. So I was up against like 10-year veterans, 20-year veterans trying to also get jobs as soon as at the time I was graduating. Interestingly enough, though, the games industry was wide open at the time. As new technologies were coming into games, they were trying to get more people who had 3D modeling experience for cinema into games as the next generation consoles were coming in. And so my training, which I thought was going to be relevant for film, became relevant for games. And so it was an open field for me to come into, and that was like an interesting and fun transition for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, the history of games has been so unique in the sense that, it started with a lot of very interdisciplinary creators in the late 70s and early 80s because the technology could be learned over a weekend. And then as the, industry grew and became more formal, you had a lot of people who specialized just in making games. And it does seem like there's a bit more moving back, hopefully, in an interdisciplinary direction for people who have don't necessarily have a traditional quote unquote games background, but are interested in working in commercial games. Well, I'd like to talk a bit about your specific contribution, like to the world, to the world of games. You came from a fine art background, and this is not one of the games that you worked on. I just want to be clear. Not one of the games that you worked on, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what UI and UX design looked like as you were entering the world of games. That's why I picked this as an example. I think this was
Yeah,
like
no.
7 FPS. I think it was like 7 frames per second for this particular
Yeah.
sequence. But tell me a little bit about like what you felt your contribution was having this non-gaming background as a UI UX person at EA.
Yeah, I'd love to. But first, I want to quickly, just as a disclaimer, I'll be saying things like I did this or I helped here, and I want to just be upfront about the fact that I had a lot of amazing mentors with shared authorship in a lot of the things I'm going to say I helped make. And so just to call out that if I don't specifically say I had help here, it doesn't mean that I did all of it, because the last thing I want people to think is that I magically made things happen on my own, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm just careful about that.
No,
So
like a one-man band like you
yeah,
with like,
which is
12 different Wacom tablets doing everything.
right, which is never the truth, right? So I just want to be clear about that. So the landscape that I came into, um, as you know, is that you know games traditionally have a HUD, and that's by design. The way we have communicated information that was beyond the ability of the game itself. So if you think about it, traditionally we started from 8-bit games, 16-bit games. There's so much that can't be said by the graphics, and so being able to communicate your health, how much ammo you have, what are the second to second goals that the player has to understand about the game. These things are then relegated to this piece of veneer, this glass that sits above the game that we call the HUD, right? And so what you're looking at here on the screen is like the epitome of all that, where there's now so much information that the player has to understand about a game. And so when I came into the world of Dead Space, I had really amazing people to work with, like Ian Millam and Ben Wanat, two of my mentors, and Chuck Beaver. These amazing people were there trying to figure out like how to make the most immersive third-person horror survival game ever. And so at the time, they gave mandates to all parts of the game team. The environment team was trying to figure out like how do we make it so that the lighting suggests like immersion. The sound team was given that same task and so on. And for UI, the move that we tried to figure out was that what can we make of the game so that it becomes diegetic, meaning, much like in audio, which is where the term comes from, how do we make it so that things that belong to the user is also the same things that belong to the character in the game, if that makes sense. So in our sense, like we tried to figure out like, can we take away the HUD from where it lives, which is like the piece of glass that only belongs to the user, and sort of put it in the world so it also belongs to the player. And so the first catalyst of this was that Ben Wanat came up with the idea of like putting the health bar on the back. And based on that, I was able to develop like everything else, like where does the ammo counter live? Where does the where does the inventory live? How do we handle doors opening and closing? What is a loading screen in a world where there is no HUD? And that's what Dead Space tried to do, which is like compartmentalize all these HUD elements into like in-game elements.
Yeah. Was there anything specific that you're pulling from your like non-gaming background? Was there any, I know it's a team-based effort, but I'm sure like breaking from the way that things are traditionally done in games is not always easy. In any industry is easy. So I was curious, was there anything from your non-game background that you were able to lean on to kind of like make your case for like why you should think about doing user interfaces in a different way?
I wish I could tell you that I had some amazing aha moments because I was like enlightened somehow, but that's never really the case. What I came with was a lot of like confident ignorance of the system, right? I came from motion graphics for the most part. So for a couple of years before this, I was working in motion graphics, basically in GameSpot, just within CNET, just making like motion graphics for shows. And I was very enamored by the notion of like floating panels in space. And if you see my demo reel at the time, I had a lot of like these, show panels. Like I did an After Effects of things just popping in and like rezzing out and whatnot. And I saw a lot of value in like the like having spatially positioned like panels with information. And so at the time I started working with our engineering for Dead Space and ignorantly really looked at like what we had. So we had a really powerful VFX tool, which was able to render sprites and whatnot in space and just like have them float around. And what I thought was like, how do I enable these how do I enable this VFX tool to be a UI tool? And really the key thing was that it needed to render text. And at the time we were thinking, well, we could just probably put bitmaps up on screen, but then that would not be localizable, nor would it be dynamic. And so the thing I had to like help convince the engineers to do was how do we make the VFX tool be a text tool? And that's really the start of the UI of Dead Space. We started being able to like, put buttons floating in space. We were able to put like little messages floating in space and whatnot. And that became the start of it all.
For those who haven't played, I have played Dead Space. It was very scary. It was very, very scary, which I know that was the intent. Can you just tell us a little bit about the game itself for folks who haven't played that particular franchise? And also because like horror games have a different relationship to like fear, and using that as a mechanic in games is different from other types of games that, other people play. I'm not a big horror fan. So
yeah.
But I enjoyed it. It was scary, but I enjoyed it. But yeah, tell us a little bit about Dead Space, the franchise, for those who don't know.
Of course. So Dead Space is a game set in a very dystopian future where you play a character named Isaac Clarke. Isaac Clarke is an engineer, and he is sent to a mining ship But so in this future, they have these giant ships called planet crackers that go and gather resources from dead planets. And so there's a planet cracker named the Ishimura that happens to be derelict, and they don't know why. So they send this engineer. So he's just a regular Joe coming into a job, and he gets there, and there are zombies, and it's reanimated corpses of people, and he has to figure out how to survive without any weaponry. And so, as an engineer, he starts working and crafting up plasma cutters and other weapons out of tools that he has all around the ship. And that's the basic premise. And in this game, you have very limited resources. And so one of the things we started to design for the game was that we wanted to really feel the fact that you don't have enough resources. And to do that, you end up doing a lot of scrounging around. And the other thing we wanted to make you feel was that you're never safe. And so one new convention we built in this game was that when you look through your inventory or when you change your weapons, you're not in a safe space. You're not like somehow paused and suddenly you're able to like manage your inventory. Part of the resourcing problem is the fact that you can be attacked while you are managing your resources. So it's a very innovative game at the time, and we had a lot of fun making it for sure.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about like in the design process, like for folks who haven't worked in games, because you mentioned some of the things that you want the player to, but you're not necessarily the person who's designing those interactions per se, right? Can you tell me a little bit about like how you work within this larger creative team? Because I think people forget this about video games. Like there's a lot of different skill sets that go into what is a non-linear process, right? So things are done simultaneously. So yeah, talk a little bit about how your team on the user interface side interface with some of the other folks working on that game.
So the I guess the most important thing I should talk about here at this juncture is the rules we set up and the principles we set up for the UI, right? So going back to our earlier conversation about a HUD has a few things that it does really well, which is that it creates muscle memory, wherein like if I was playing a game, the last thing I want to do is scrounge around the screen to find out what my health is, right? There's very definite places for things and where they live. And so that's the value of the HUD. And so if we are indeed taking it away, what rules can we set up so that our UI still functions like a HUD? And so we had to set up 3 principles for this. The first one for our HUD is that we wanted it to be pronounced. And by that, I mean, it needs to be easily understandable, right? So in one, like if you watch videos of people playing games or even Dead Space, people can mash through a game because they can like see what the UI means in a split second. They shouldn't be making like long meditative discussions in their head about like which is the right button. The color language has to be very clear. There has to be some clear indication in pictograms of like what is happening and where they're going. The second principle that we came up with is that the HUD is secondary, right? It can't overshadow the game, much like in the original intent of a HUD. And a HUD was in support of the experience, and so it has to be supplementary and not the star of the show. The last one, which might seem harder to do in the styling that we've come up with, is that the HUD has to be predictable. Meaning, like I was saying earlier, you're building muscle memory with where everything is. And so what people don't actually realize with Dead Space is that even though the HUD is embedded into the game, these rules about predictability stand true. Like if you play Dead Space now or just reopen it or like watch some videos, you'll notice a few things. Isaac is always on the left side of the screen. You can probably spin the camera around and put him in a weird spot, but he'll always fall to the left, which puts the health bar squarely on the left lower side of the screen and never leaves that area. The ammo counter is attached to the gun, so if you ever open it up, it's always in the center of the screen and never leaves that spot, and so you know exactly where you're looking for that. And there's other elements of the screen that follow the same rule set, and so These are the things we came up with, and we worked with the rest of the Dead Space team to make sure that we honor these as we build the game. The other thing is just color language, right? So in Dead Space, there's basically three types of floating holograms you will see. There's ones that are the bluish white, there's ones that are amber, and there's ones that are red. And the color language that we basically came up with is that anything that's amber colored is just ambient and it's just for styling. But when things are white or bluish, you could walk up to it and interact with it. And red means it's not working now, but it could work later on. So it means locked. And so with that very simple color language, you can then watch videos of people playing the game, and they can like bash through the game without even looking at the UI. And as you may possibly imagine, like a lot of this UI was handcrafted and designed, and we spent hours upon days of making it. And you know it works when people don't even look at it, and they just bash through it, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the rules we set up.
Yeah, exactly. People, it's like, oh, I worked on the interface for Dead Space, and people are like, what? I don't remember the interface, and you're like, exactly. I was never here. One last thing, and then we'll talk about some of your work at Oculus. In the time that you've been working, how do you think that video games have evolved, like in the time since, because you've been doing this, you worked in games for quite some time, and just we're going to move away from games to talk about some of the work that you're doing, at Facebook. But what have you seen, just as no longer working in the world of games? What are some things that you've seen, maybe for good and for bad, that have in your particular field, that have happened in the world of games?
There's been a big roller coaster ride of shifts and changes in the what's in vogue and also what's acceptable ethically in games. There was a moment like in time, and perfectly enough, like you're showing a screen right now of Dead Space 3, which was the moment in time where EA was like gung-ho about microtransactions. And it was a very painful moment as a developer, for us to rely on this for a game to survive, right? We've since found other ways. Like EA now has more of a subscription model, that's allowed them to shift away from this very nickel and dimey approach. So there was a shift away from that, and then now I think we're in this like era of like smaller games really making it, right? And making it really about like smaller teams making smaller bets, and it's okay for games not to be very epic in scale.
Yeah.
There's just amazing bigger range of games right now, and so I think the shift away from like big blockbusters is into like more indie has been really fascinating and interesting for me to see.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's obviously very difficult for someone like you with a design background, like you're working within the financial constraints of the company that you work in, and so that sometimes dictates what ultimately gets made. Well, let's move on to some of your work at Facebook Reality Labs and Oculus. So you joined Oculus in 2015, just after the company was acquired by Facebook. And Abel asked us a great question, wanting to know, since you had that background in gaming UX and you currently work in Oculus, can you talk about some of the differences between the different UX and UX experience challenges that you faced in these different environments?
Abel, that's an amazing question. So I I was hired primarily, if I can be honest, because of some of the experience I had working on Dead Space. And when we were working early, so when I first joined Oculus, I was part of a small strike team called Oculus Rex. And we were the team that worked on everything from First Contact, which is that robot that you meet when you first turn on your Rift, when you first bought it. Oh, sorry, when you got your touch controllers, to Farlands, which was his first experience that I worked on there, where you basically earn the trust of like alien creatures on a interestingly weird planet, to like Dream Deck, which was like this slew of demos to show the power of VR. But anyway, when I first got hired on, it was to join the strike team of like amazing game developers from many different like companies who were trying to like create like what VR could look like. And they were attracted to my experience in Dead Space. But one thing we quickly learned was that a lot of the things I believed to work in 2D UI didn't actually transfer over very well in VR. So, for example, um, one thing we realized is that the dexterity of your eyeballs and your fingers are so much higher than your neck and your full arms.
Oh,
And so
interesting.
that starts to affect the where you put UI. So if you look at Dead Space, and you look at the screen of like where I put UI, it's everything from, okay, it's in the far left, the far right, forward and back, and everywhere around you. And when you're in the interface, like let's say you're in the ammo, like right there, like you're in the inventory, or maybe if you were in the weapon crafting machine, there's UI around you everywhere. One thing you realize in VR is that um, the dream is that UI will be all around you, but guess what? The limitations of your own neck and like actual ergonomics forces you to put UI closer to the middle, right? One thing you don't want to do is overstretch someone's like neck all around or have them like go everywhere just to grab stuff. The dream of that Tom Cruise feature where you're just like doing this is not a reality, right? The truth is that if you ever played the Switch, sorry, not the Switch, but if you ever played the Wii, the first week you got Wii Sports, you were like standing there playing tennis like a madman, right? Within a week, you're just sitting there and just doing little hand flicks, and that's just the nature of the human anatomy. We try to find the most comfortable way to do something, and so there's no future where we're doing this, and so that's one of the first lessons I learned, right? And the second one that didn't quite pan over from uh, from 2D to VR was um, I had this romantic relationship with holograms and transparency and how that looks in 2D. And in 2D, when you see a hologram, one of the joys of it is that you see it and you see what's behind it, and it's just all beautiful. But again, you're looking at it without any dimensionality, and so it's fine. But if you think about it, if you actually had holograms and you are forcing someone to look through translucent things in reality or in VR, it's actually quite unnerving, and it causes a lot of like nausea. And
Mm.
so I guess all these things I'm talking about right now, unfortunately, is me just dispelling all the beautiful things I thought I could do in 2D that don't quite transfer to VR. So there was a lot of those lessons, but also there were things that we were able to transfer over, right? So for example, all the motion language that I understood in 2D, like knowing that if I want something to be attractive or something to be seen, then it has to be coupled with a clear motion and sound, and the relationship in like the orchestration around these things became very apparent in VR. Like we
Mm.
need to be very clear about like what we want people to look at, for
Yeah.
example.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. Can you talk a little bit about some of the cultural shifts between, because Oculus, as a gaming company, it was really thought of as more as a gaming company. It was populated by a lot of gaming folks. Facebook, different company, different life cycle, different stage, different approach to, product design. So I was just curious about what were some of the shifts that you had noticed now being at Oculus and now at Facebook that might juxtapose those two different company cultures.
No, that's an excellent question. So Oculus, when it was starting out, as you would imagine, it was very much uh, populated by people coming from games, and this might be more evident of my personal experience. So if people from games disagree with this, please tell me. But I came from a world, in making games where we were more driven by our past experiences in our arguments. Meaning, if I was going to argue for a certain styling or a certain render technique, I would say I did this in X, Y, and Z game, therefore I believe it'll work here. A lot of our reasoning was experiential. Um, Facebook is a much bigger design culture that has a lot more um, built knowledge that is more than just experience, right? So it's quite possible that someone will make a strong argument in Facebook and use research, whether it's their own their own user research, or whether it's data driven from other products, or it's research by other specialists in related mediums. And um, I see people using more of those kinds of arguments to further a product. And I think ultimately both are great, right? The right kind of development, the right kind of design is one that can rely on both of those things. And so I think one thing that we do really well in the Avatar team that I'm part of is that we have a great mix of people that have both of those types of experiences, whether it's people that I work with in art, people in the design discipline, or even our producers um, and technical artists. Like the fact that we have so much information from people from that work in Pixar, DreamWorks, that worked in games, worked in ILM, and also worked in like the traditional, sorry, not traditional, but the more ingrained product design field within Facebook. Like we have a lot of inputs coming in, and it's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting to hear. Well, I want to talk a bit about your avatar work. So, in your experience, what makes for well, can you talk a little bit about the we spoke about this a little bit in our little chat beforehand about the evolution and the approach to creating digital avatars in virtual reality or in these digital spaces like at Facebook, because it sounds like there was some kind of competing and complementary approaches to like what characters should look like in these digital spaces.
Yes.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience building those.
I'd love to talk about that. Yeah. So the screen you're showing right now, these are the codec avatars, which is like more future looking. And I just want to call out that this is amazing work that I am not really working with right now. Like the area of work I'm working on is the more near term avatars that we're trying to figure out. So to give you a little bit of background, um, for the last, I guess, 5 6 years, Oculus and Facebook, company to that whole conglomerate of a company together has been figuring out like digital representation and identity. And there have been many different versions of attempts at this from within the company, three of which all have been like the strongest and biggest ones were the one from Horizon, which originally was the work from Facebook Spaces, which was the most, I would say, the most delightful looking and the most expressive of the avatars that Facebook had been making. And then the other one was the one from Oculus, which was, not as expressive, but was the most integrated. And if you, these are the ones we currently have right now in the system, and what they look like are you've got a face and you've got hands. They're less expressive, but these are the same ones we've got SDKs for to run on PokerStars or other games from within the system. And then there's a third one, which is the Facebook sticker avatars, which are the ones you could use right now in your mobile app, and you can make stickers of them, and they're very expressive, and actually the most diverse and the most inclusive of the avatars. So the goal of the team that I'm part of has been to try to see if we can combine all these three things into one new product that has the integration of the Oculus version, the delight and like expressiveness of the Horizon version, and then the inclusivity and the optionality of the Facebook one. So imagine like the Facebook one, it's kind of it's 2D right now, but imagine it being more 3D, and then has the delightfulness of Horizon and like the integration of Oculus.
Yeah. Can you tell, so your background, like working in gaming, like how did that impact like your point of view on avatars? Because it's been very interesting, I think, for folks who maybe were acquainted with virtual reality or became acquainted with digital virtual spaces like through virtual reality, but hadn't really spent a lot of time playing video games, or they came to like virtual reality, but they're coming from some of these other places. So whether that's like, Bitmoji or other, SMS based like avatar creation tools. Can you tell me a little bit about like what your perspective, like as a games person, like what is your addition kind of to that overall conversation? What's different about designing game avatars versus like ones for other digital spaces?
That's a fascinating question, and if let me think about that. Well, the work that I've done in games made me realize like that the way we should imagine um, entitlements for avatars, and I'll explain what that means. Right. So um, back when I was working on Battlefield, there was a concept of like, well, here are my stock options, right? As an avatar, I mean, or a character in a game, I can build myself up. And if you think about it, the bonding that you have with your avatar, and we have research that shows this, has a lot to do with how personal and how unique you can make yourself, right? So if you're coming into Battlefield and you can make yourself, a medic type class, and you've got all this basic medic stuff, um, it's great. But you also know that 600 other people playing the game right now, or 6,000 other people playing the game right now, could look exactly like you do. And so this opens up the conversation to like, how do I, if you can imagine that there's like a Gap store style version of an editor, and there's like, a certain set of shirts you can pick up, or a certain set of pants you can pick up. How do I make myself stand out, right? So, you personally probably picked out those glasses because you feel represented by them. There's a sense of identity that comes with you wearing them, right? And so when you walk in a room, this is you, and this is how you present yourself.
Sometimes I'm worried that's all people see is just like a pair of just like
Your
floating glasses, like in the back.
Where'd you go? Where are you?
Exactly.
There you are.
Exactly.
No, but the point I'm trying to make here is that this is where entitlements come in, right? In this spectrum, like if you think about it in games, this is a well understood thing where entitlements are basically three different things. There's promotional, right? Stuff that is seasonal based. If you're playing Battlefield right now, they could say that, oh, every Tuesday you can unlock a certain color fatigue because you were there playing on that Tuesday. And then there's also this notion of like progression based, right? So the notion of like, if I was playing the game right now, if I do X, Y, and Z, I've now unlocked a thing that allows me to be unique in a different way. And then there's the last thing, which is commerce, which is the easiest understood one, which is that I could buy this, ergo I become this, right? So now this is the kind of stuff that I feel that we've learned to transfer over to the way Facebook thinks. Interestingly enough, this has not come easy with Facebook, right? Facebook is designed to be egalitarian in that what I get is what you get, right? So I never come into Facebook and think, gee, what can I buy to make me unique that nobody else has, right? And so there's this concept right now that we're bringing in as we understand how to build avatars. That's how do we build like entitlements for people, whether it's promotional, progression, or commerce based, that can then slowly bleed into where avatars are going to go into the whole ecosystem. So this is new stuff we're figuring out, stuff that we know is controversial. Not just because it's a game concept that doesn't belong in Facebook proper yet, but also because we're Facebook and people will question these things, right? If we were another company trying to introduce, entitlements to an identity, they'll probably say, "Oh, that's awesome." But because it's Facebook, there's a lot of thinking about like, how do we innovate with responsibility as we do this?
Cool. Well, one last question, and then we'll kick it over to Q&A. So if you have any Q&A questions, feel free. And if you do ask any Q&A questions, as someone who has a different sounding name, if you want, I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly. So if you want to type in the phonetic spelling, that'd be great. Otherwise, don't worry about it. One of the questions I have for you, Dino, is it's just about, so you grew up in the Philippines, and Facebook is a global platform, and increasingly, and this is something, video games are a global platform, right? So increasingly our experiences are becoming more and more shared, right? So Netflix is available all over the world, and then vice versa. There are things from other countries that are making our way into Minari, that's nominated for the Oscars. And like you're starting to see more of a back and forth, which is great between a lot of different countries, particularly in digital environments. How are you thinking about like avatar development in in a global context? Because I suspect that must be very hard to do for a platform that that hosts hundreds of millions, billions of people on it.
Yeah, no, this is actually a fascinating question. You know, on one end, you could imagine that it would be great is if as you build your avatar, that it would make recommendations for you based on your choices. You would imagine that that's probably a great thing. But you could also probably imagine the other side of that, where if I start making choices, let's say I define my hair color and my skin color, and it starts to suggest certain types of clothing, then that would be racial profiling, right? So there's like lots of things here that we still need to unpack and understand. And what does regionality do for avatars, right? So are there entitlements that are based on where I am, right? For example, could I have um, a Filipino costume, barong, like the traditional formal wear available to me if I somehow are in the Philippines versus the US? Or do we open it all up so that all clothing is available everywhere?
Right. Yeah.
All to say that these are considerations we're still trying to figure out. But yes, obviously, a lot of testing is going on, and if you know how Facebook works, it does regional testing, right? Whether it goes to India first or it goes to Brazil first to try to figure out like how people use a certain product. We look at these things very closely to understand patterns of usage. I wish I could say more, but just suffice to say that we are indeed doing a lot of these tests to make sure that what we're making is responsible as it tackles these things like culture, right? So one thing that I'm still trying to figure out, and I honestly don't know the answer to, is can avatars be weaponized, right? So for example, um, I'm probably gonna make some avatar of myself with my skin color
Yeah.
and my lips and my eyes, and what's stopping somebody else to pardon the term, but do digital blackface, right?
Yeah.
Can they do
Yeah.
that? And how do we prevent that? Should we prevent that? There's so many questions that we're still trying to figure out that we're tr- being very careful about, right? So one direction we could possibly take is to be more proactive, meaning I could log on to the system, and if I changed my skin color by 6 shades, it could put up a pop-up and say, are you sure you want to do this?
You're
Here's
right.
some
Yeah.
guidelines. Or it could be more reactive in terms of like, if you do it, maybe someone will have to report you for it to be blocked, right? So there's lots of things to be unpacked and figured out here. Suffice to say, we are thinking about all of it.
Yeah. Great. Well, we've got a couple questions here on the Q&A side. We've got a question from Abder Toure. Abder's from the UK and just finished their A levels, which is high school, and they don't want to go to university. They said they're passionate about virtual reality. They have a computer science background. They wanted to know what advice they would have for them and for someone that has, in their words, no experience. What do they do to reach their goals and how to stay motivated through this whole journey without necessarily having a mentor, which is also very difficult.
Those are excellent questions. What was the person's name again? Sorry.
I believe it's Abder. Yeah.
Abder, those are excellent questions. And I asked those many same things when I was younger. And it's a whole different world now, right? So even now, you're reaching out to me and we're connecting and you're able to hear me talk to you back. And there was a time when that was not possible, right? I could read about people in books. I was a big fan of David Carson, but there was no way I was gonna, reach out and like find a way to connect with him. Um, and then but now the world's changed where you could send a tweet to someone and they will reply, and mentorships happen that way. It doesn't need to be formal. And then there's YouTube. There's lots of places where you can learn new stuff. There's so much information. We're in an amazing age where information is freely given and shared, and you can understand design concepts just by watching videos. It's crazy. And lastly, I would say the tools that allow you to learn and build stuff have also been democratized, right? So if you wanted to pick up Unity just today, there's a way to do that for free as a student, or Unreal even, and just learn and just watch some videos on YouTube and just pick up how to build stuff. The key, I guess I'm trying to say, is that um, the tools are there. You can build stuff on your own and start sharing it out. It's a few years ago, when we were trying to hire people at Facebook to do all the stuff we're doing now, there wasn't like a lot of people who had real VR experience. So we're borrowing from people who knew architecture or industrial design or video games. But fast forward to like even just 3 years after, there's now people who understand games and VR and all this stuff by virtue of just like making them happen, right? So it's cheap enough to get a headset, it's cheap enough to get a computer, and it's free to get Unity. And with all those three things, you can start making demos of your ideas and your concepts. And if you share them out, you'll get feedback from people, and that's the best way to learn.
All right, cool. Yeah, and I'm dare also say we're planning on doing a lot more of these type events to bring people like Dino to talk about their experience and share what it is they know. Keanu De Sousa says, do you see VR gaming, the VR gaming sphere take off with more story-based game, with more story-like driven games, the level of interaction in games from the studio? Quantic Dream is one that they mentioned, just in terms of more interactive cinematic storytelling in gaming with multiple points of interaction through decision-based context. Do you think that that's something that we're going to see more of?
I mean, I can be hopeful, and I would like to. Like that's my jam. That's what I love. I think if you can imagine where we are now in VR games, it's very different from where we are in traditional games, right? So traditional games, such as like I mentioned earlier, has gone through the whole gamut of like going through its like blockbuster era to now it's more indie, era where we have quieter games, right? VR is going to go through the same thing, right? Right now, there's a lot of like, how shall I say it? We're still at that stage where we're trying to see what we can do with color TV with VR, right? So
yeah,
it's almost like everything is saturated. Everything is like, touch this, fire this, run this. Like we're still experimenting, but it's slowly changing, right? I think more story-based games will come as more quieter games will come. And it also comes with like the tools improving, right? So the barrier to entry to all this is, how big do the teams need to be successful at the price point games are in. And as the tools get better, people will be a little bit more experimental, and with that comes the kind of games that you're talking about, right? Less of the flashy, which I still love, but like the robo recalls and whatnot. Like we're talking about like more quieter games,
yeah.
more like story driven stuff.
Miles Hurst says, greetings from Canada. Miles is someone who's looking to showcase their UI work in their portfolio. They wanted to know what would employers be looking for or want to see from UI artists, and what would make their work stand out.
Miles, that's a great question. So I've been on the other side of the interview table enough, and I'll tell you what we're looking for, right? So first of all, having a killer demo reel that shows just the best parts of what you've made as a video is always great. The second one is if you have a demo that people can try, that'll show 10x more than a video ever could, because then now we understand how you have transferred your skills into something really tangible and something we can try. And lastly, when people do interviews and whatnot, it's good that you come in with 2 or 3 case studies of how you've solved things. So instead of just saying, my name is Mike, here's what I've done in school, and here's a video of some of my work, and here's how I succeeded. What people actually want to hear from the other side of the table is how you may have failed as well, and also what took you to how you got to the success you got to. So walking people through a design problem, being very clear about like what was needed for it to happen, what the constraints were, and what steps you took to get there, and then like a metric at the very end to show that you succeeded. If you can tell that story one or two or three times through an interview based on like past work, you're golden, right? So more important than whether or not you succeeded in interviews, what people are looking for is what's your thought process, and do you have a clear vision of what you wanted, and whether or not you got there, you can break down what the steps were in trying to get there.
Awesome. Great. That's a great question. Thank you, Miles, for asking. All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Risa, thank you so much. I hope I got your name right. A lot of games are re-examining, Risa asks, a lot of games are re-examining stories built on concepts of colonialism and manifest destiny. So you see that a lot with like resource extraction games, right? On top of narrative, how do you see these efforts showing up? Do you see UX, UI, or other design elements evolving to support goals that are more in the interest of collective success and accountability, rather than conquering and taking whatever you can get your hands on? So it's a good
Wow, that's a great one.
question. Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm armed to answer this properly. I'll give you my personal bias, and is that I think we have a personal responsibility as designers, and I'm talking about you, Risa, not just myself, um, to change the conversation, right? So a lot of the games that we have right now, and the main currency is violence, right? The main currency is how do I get the best headshot? And I'm no stranger to this. A good 10 years of my career was built on this. And one of the reasons why I moved to Oculus at the time was to change that. Like I have a responsibility now raising a 9-year-old girl to make games that don't rely on the currency of headshots. And so the question I have throwing back to you, whether it's the conquering metaphor of resource gathering or shooting people in the head, like what are the other things that we can consider a goal for games? Whether is it friendship? Is it making connections? Is it solving problems? Is it fixing things instead of destroying things? What else can we do? And I know that sounds really touchy-feely and vague, but this is honestly, I believe in the same thing you're talking about. But I throw it back only because I think it's on all of us to do this, right? So, like I said earlier, we can be more experimental with games. And if so, what can we make games be about? What are the intrinsic goals we want games to be about? It doesn't have to be kill the dragon, right? It could be, find friendship. It could be rebuild a city, right? These are as exciting if we allow them to be.
Yeah. Just to, I think, Dino, just to press on that one a little bit more with you, has there been something that you've been able to, like at Facebook, work on in terms of those advancing from a design perspective, being able to advance that idea of collective success, accountability versus like one person versus the entire world?
Yeah, Horizon is built on this, right? So I can't take credit for this. We've got amazing designers working on this over there. I was helping out for a bit for a while, but the kind of games that they're interested in building over there has been centered around like collaboration, right? So they will have like games where you have paintball and shoot people and whatnot, but ultimately they're trying to create a central mechanic around collaboration and building connections and biasing for those things so that you're building a positive community, right? So we've seen research that if the if the if the world you're in is predisposed to positivity and connection, then that is the culture and behavior you're going to expect from people around you, right? So that's the main thesis of how Horizon is built and how we look at the future of the metaverse.
All right. Well, Dino, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. Thanks to all of you for joining us for our first Killscreen webinar. I really appreciate it. It's our first time trying new things. You can follow Dino on Instagram and Twitter, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can also sign up for our mailing list. We're going to be doing more events like this in the upcoming weeks, talking to creators about the creative process and hearing a bit more about how they make things. So, Dino, thank you so much, and everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks for having me. Take
All
care.
right.